It's Wednesday, the 19th February 2025. Let's take a look at the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. First, the Punch newspaper, the leading story. Workers in 109 embassies groan over 6 months unpaid salaries. Ministry promises to clear arrears. Ex-envoys cake. You can get all of this story on page 2 of the Punch newspaper. And above the leading story from the left, inflation drop. Experts demand lower interest rates. You can get the complete story on page 2 of the Punch newspaper. Dangote's wealth raises to $24 billion after refineries operations. You can get the complete story on page 21 of the Punch newspaper. Tinubu, Obasanjo, others mourn as Edwin Clark dies at 97. You can get the complete story on page 31 of the Punch newspaper. 54 trillion naira budget. National Assembly raises recurrent vote. Cuts 500 billion naira from capital spending. You can get the complete story on page 18 of the Punch newspaper. And below the leading story from the right, John Vent's UK agency invests $40.5 million to expand Nigeria's cocoa industry. You can get the complete story on page 22 of the Punch newspaper. Ukraine protests exclusion as US, Russia raise team to end war. You can get the complete story on page 30 of the Punch newspaper. And below the leading story from the left, Lagos Assembly says Tinubu's wife not involved in crisis. You can get the complete story on page 30 of the Punch newspaper. Immigration arrests 40 illegal immigrants in Oyo. You can get the complete story on page 16 of the Punch newspaper. Osun crisis. Police go after killers. LG pool holds Saturday. You can get the complete story on page 30 of the Punch newspaper. Moving over to the next paper, Vanguard, the leading story. Special report. High electricity costs choking teaching hospitals to death. You can get the complete story on page 14 of the Vanguard. And above the leading story, CBN directs banks to publish dormant accounts. You can get the complete story on page 19 of the Vanguard. Education suffers reduced allocations as NAS amends past 2025 budget. You can get the complete story on page 8 of the Vanguard. Federal government commissions NDLEA's first barracks in Yola after 35 years. You can get the complete story on page 9 of the Vanguard. Military should be barred from election in Nigeria, said Jonathan. You can get the complete story on page 8 of the Vanguard. And below the leading story, Edwin Clark, 1927 to 2025. His last words, "Don't give up on making Nigeria better," says family. As Tinubu, Obasanjo, Jonathan, Atiku, Akpabio, Obi, governors, others mourn, Bayelsa directs all flags to fly at half-mast for 3 days. You can get all of this story on page 5 of the Vanguard. Boko Haram, US to audit aid funds to Nigeria. You can get the complete story on page 24 of the Vanguard. NDDC, group warns organizers to desist from protest. You can get the complete story on page 12 of the Vanguard. Fears grow over Pope's health as Vatican cancels upcoming events. You can get the complete story on page 8 of the Vanguard. Shirley to watch Musa Kanu pillars. You can get the complete story on page 30 of the Vanguard. Moving over to the next paper, The Guardian, the leading story. Edwin Clark, a life of struggles, statesmanship, agitation for true federalism. Tinubu, Obasanjo, Atiku, Obi, governors led tribute to Ijaw leader. You can get the complete story on page 4 and 5 of The Guardian. And above the leading story from the left, House summon INEC over delay in conducting by-elections. You can get the complete story on page 3 of The Guardian. NBA unveils new inflation template, reduces food weight to 40%. You can get the complete story on page 3 of The Guardian. Sanwo-Olu don raise alarm over rising mental health issues among boys. You can get the complete story on page 7 of The Guardian, and below the leading story from the left. Federal government launches nationwide crackdown on miracle centers. You can get the complete story on page 6 of The Guardian. Lagos Assembly denies Tinubu's involvement in crisis. You can get the complete story on page 7 of The Guardian. Concerns over critical mineral safety, rising vulnerability, illegal mining. You can get the complete story on page 15 of The Guardian. Defense headquarters confirms rehabilitations, reintegration of 789 ex-terrorists. You can get the complete story on page 30 of The Guardian. Niger Delta Group warns against disruption of peace in region. You can get the complete story on page 29 of The Guardian. Moving over to the next paper, Nigeria Tribune. The leading story. Bank directors with non-performing inside loans to resign, CBN orders. Ask banks to regularize loans within 180 days. You can get all of this story on page 6 of the Tribune. And above the leading story from the left, NBS explains why Nigeria's inflation rate falls to 24.48% after rebasing. You can get the complete story on page 6 of the Tribune. 5 days after passage, NAS adjusts portions of 2025 budgets, retains 54.99 trillion naira total. You can get the complete story on page 7 of the Tribune. Reps to organize public hearing on new tax reforms bills next Wednesday. Probe INEC over delay in conducting over 12 by-elections. You can get all of this story on page 4 of the Tribune, and below the leading story from the left. Southwest governors will give Adebanjo befitting funeral, says Sanwo-Olu. You can get the complete story on page 10 of the Tribune. Lagos Assembly crisis, DSS threatens lawsuit against broadcast stations. You can get the complete story on page 13 of the Tribune. Don't disrupt peace of Niger Delta over murder of all protests. Niger Delta peace advocates warns. You can get the complete story on page 14 of the Tribune. Edo Assembly approves death sentence for kidnappers. You can get the complete story on page 28 of the Tribune. Jonathan kicks against deployment of military personnel for elections. Says only police, INEC should manage future elections. Obi says integrity of election determined by leadership in charge. You can get the complete story on page 13 of the Tribune. Edwin Clark, 25 May 1927 to 17 February 2025. Tinubu, Obasanjo, Jonathan, Atiku, governors, others pay tributes. Dodge fighters, uncompromising patriots, bridge builder. You can get all of this story on page 3, 17, 18, and 19 of the Tribune. 789 ex-terrorists undergoing the radicalization rehabilitation program. You can get the complete story on page 26 of the Tribune. Appeal court affirms Oba Olaoye as son of Ogbomosho. You can get the complete story on page 20 of the Tribune. Moving over to the next paper, Daily Trust. The leading story. Boko Haram. US probes aid to Nigeria. Ndume calls for investigation. Borno elders want NGOs sacked. You can get all of this story on page 4 of the Daily Trust. Historic relief. President Tinubu wipes out long-outstanding pension backlog. Moving over to the last paper on the list, Business Day, the leading story. Rebase inflation rates stoke interest rate uncertainty. You can get the complete story on page 31 of the newspaper. And beside the leading story from the right, petrol imports persist amid rising local output. NNPC denies importing in 2025. You can get all of this story on page 30 of the newspaper. And below the leading story from the left, business confidence grows as reforms bear fruit. You can get the complete story on page 30 of the newspaper. Nigeria's $34 billion lithium reserves in demand amid global rush. You can get the complete story on page 31 of the newspaper, and these are the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. If any of these headlines caught your attention, do get a copy of the paper to read the complete story.
Visit Housing TV Africa on YouTube and click on the subscribe button. Subscribe to Housing TV Africa to stay updated on latest happenings in Nigeria's housing sector. Follow our social media pages, like and share our posts on Facebook, Housing TV Africa, on Twitter, Housing TV Africa, Instagram, Housing TV Africa. Join the conversation and keep up with latest housing updates.
Housing TV Africa, your first in housing development broadcasting.